Okay, so I'm going to be presenting about energy, and I just want to ask everyone here, what is energy? Like, just don't give me the engineering definition of it, please. Just what is energy to us? Okay, fuel to do stuff. Actually, pretty much. Fuel to do stuff. That's exactly what I was looking for. Okay, no one said congratulations. So, why does energy matter? I just want to see what you all think at the moment, and then I'll say something about it. Why does energy matter to us? United States, when I say us.
Build things.
Okay, no, not really. But yeah, we do like to be on top of innovation. Any opinions as to why energy matters?
You can't use much technology without energy.
Good, that's a good one. I like that one. Anything else? No.
We can't power our homes and cars without energy.
Perfect. But there's also another one. National security issues. So we've been importing a lot of energy, and not just in terms of like petroleum and all that, but just foreign markets are like basically supplying us with the energy that we need. I think at the moment it's around 50%. So that creates a huge dependency issue on foreign reserves of energy. And as we know, those markets are extremely volatile. The other thing is that petroleum reserves are, despite what you hear a lot of pundits say, they are on the decline. Not as rapid as you may be hearing on the news, but still rapid enough that it's something to take into consideration. I just have two charts up here. That's U.S. oil imports. That's just a percentage of where we get our imports from. Just realize that that's roughly 50% of our oil reserves. And then I would like to make note of that date right there, 1970. It's a very important date in energy. That's where the Clean Air Act was established, as well as the EPA through NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act. And but notice something curious here. Even though our production in oil went down, what happened to our imports? They started rising. So even though we need to establish something to reduce pollution and all that, our demand was still high enough that we needed to offset it with imports. It's just a classic supply and demand issue there. So what actions have been taken? Incentive building for alternative fuels. That just means tax breaks, loans, grants, anything to promote the creation of alternative fuels and just to promote a shift, a transition in energy use. That's exactly what it leads into. They're pretty much, the incentive building pretty much leads into creation of alternative fuels. When I say alternative fuels, I mean strictly bioethanol and biodiesel, because they're alternative sources of energy, but alternative fuels have to go through a registration process that leads into it being considered a alternative fuel in respect to petroleum. And model redesign, that's actually more of an engineering concept. Why is redesign important for energy? It's very simple. Someone please tell me.
Efficiency.
Yeah, who said that? Yeah, that's exactly it. Efficiency. A lot of our systems are very inefficient, and a lot of things have not been renovated since like the 50s. So there's a lot of heat loss involved, and that requires more fuel to power. So by just fixing that, we can save energy in the long run. So what fuels are currently available? I said fuels because I was thinking mostly of the automobile industry. But I really mean like sources of energy, because you'll notice that I put electricity. It acts as a fuel, but it's not, by strict definition, not technically a fuel. Well, these are all the ones that are currently on the market. Hydrogen being an interesting one, but not very efficient at the moment. And right now I'm just going to talk about, just go over 4 of them really fast. Cost of biodiesel. Note that still, it's less expensive than diesel, but it has lots of production costs, which is what steers firms away from doing it. Even though it's more efficient for consumers, it does bring a lot of costs for firms. And that's why they try not to do biodiesel, but that's where the incentives come in. The tax breaks, grants, and loans. Cost of ethanol is actually kind of different in that aspect. They actually cost more to do, but the production process can actually be cheaper. Bioethanol literally just means ethanol, the things you drink in alcohol. It's the exact same thing, but I'll explain bioethanol a little bit later because that's the main point of this presentation. Now, electric cars is actually my favorite one. I didn't talk about it just because I liked it so much, and I want to talk about something I just despised, which is bioethanol. Yeah, upfront cost of an electric car is much higher than just getting a regular car. But look at the fuel cost and the maintenance of an electric car. Much less than what you'd be spending on just other cars, which is the one on the right, but the one in the middle, by the way. And then diesel trucks are just way off. Diesel trucks, there's no way to fix trucks and efficiency. There just has to be a new way to do it. And then hydrogen, I honestly don't understand hydrogen as much just because it's an entirely different process involved in the production of it and using it as a fuel source. But let's go into bioethanol. So what is bioethanol? Anyone here have any idea what it is?
Turning plants into gasoline.
Pretty much, but what type of plants? Usually.
It's usually corn, yeah.
Usually corn, yeah. There's another one that's becoming popular. Anyone know what it is?
Is it sugar? Or
Yeah, actually, sugarcane. That's it. That one's becoming really popular, but at the moment, corn is still the most used one for bioethanol. So, what is bioethanol? You just said it's ethanol made through crops, but it's a different industry because this is for fuel purposes. So, just a quick overview of what bioethanol is. Actually, let me just go through Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act, like, as I said, was done in 1970. And it was what established many programs and many regulations for it. It was, 1 second, sorry about that. In Clean Air Act came alongside NEPA and established 4 regulatory programs. You got the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the State Implementation Plans, New Source Performance Standards, and National Emission Standard for Hazardous Air Pollutants. And even though people say the Clean Air Act is what established the EPA, it's actually NEPA that established it, but the EPA was established as to enforce those programs. And then there was 2 amendments, one in 1977 and one in 1990. 1977 was just improving the enforcement of NAAQS, which is the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and 1990 was giving the federal government a greater role in promoting clean air and energy. Now, the thing about bioethanol is that, unlike what people think, is that you're not powering your car with ethanol. It's actually used as a fuel additive, mostly. So, what that means is that they take petroleum and they mix it with ethanol, and they change the composition of it to be. When you see E15, that means 15% of that gas is ethanol, while the rest is petroleum. But in order for that to happen, obviously firms can create different combinations of it, different methods, different processes, so they have to go through a registration for it. And then at that moment, that's when it becomes considered an alternative fuel. And then there's E10 regulation. That's usually for owners of the ethanol gas, and they just have to basically say this is E10, because if you're to put a E10 gas into, like, let's say a car from like 1990, it's going to wreck that car because the engine just can't handle it. Anything above 2001 can handle E10, and anything above 2006 at the moment can handle E15. And that's just what the regulation is there for. But so why do they promote bioethanol? The main thing is that they assume that there's a net gain in consumer welfare, because even though you're still burning petroleum, it goes carbon dioxide to produce. Since what makes bioethanol renewable is the fact that it's grown through crops, and crops go through photosynthesis, so the sunlight is what makes it considered a renewable resource. They figure, oh, the plants will just take carbon dioxide, so it's offset by that. So that's a giant assumption that they make. I don't really agree with that as much. And for firms, what promotes them is just those incentives. There's many incentives. I'll go through a list of them for you right now. Alternative fuel infrastructure tax credit. Basically, you get 30% of the cost of what the ethanol is. So you can get $30,000 just to create ethanol, and then use it for fuel purposes. Then you have ARPA. They're big into trying to make a transition into ethanol fuel. And they just fund projects. They're like, you have an idea to create a new E10 alternative fuel, to be like, okay, we'll fund you up to 100%. And there's another one that's up to 100%, but if it's greater than 80%, the improved energy technology loans. For those loans, you have to go through the Treasury Department's federal financing bank, just because they themselves don't have the funds for it, but the Treasury Bank has an agreement with them, and that they will fund it for you. And that's just a list of 3, but there's literally dozens for incentive building to actually promote the use. But I consider the fact that there's an additional cost, and I bring up the agriculture issue. I'm sure all of you know about the food crisis that's currently happening around the world. Well, no, anyone here, who here doesn't know about the food crisis? You don't know.
Yeah, cool.
So I say 2008, although it's been going on a lot longer than that. It's ever since the bioethanol market started taking off back in 2000. So even though bioethanol has been around for a lot longer than that, it just became more popular around 2000. And then that's when you see food prices rise. You just see a huge interconnectedness of the food market and the fuel market. So the fact that corn is being used a lot for ethanol increases the demand of it, and it raises the cost of that crop. But what else is corn used for?
Every processed food in the market.
Pretty much, yes. Livestock prices, meat prices, everything goes up as a result of the increase in demand of corn. So it's commonly seen as a demand issue, but I bring in my own arguments for the supply side of it. So my question is whether bioethanol is viable and a good solution. And I define viable and good as sustainable and increases net social welfare. And so there's some terminology you have to know, what a hectare is and what a land grab is. You don't know what either are? A hectare is a form of is an area. So 1 hectare is 10,000 square meters, which is roughly 2-point-something acres. And it's just the world is divided into hectares, so that way there's no overlap with it. What's a land grab? Anyone know? No one knows what land grab is? It's basically when firms just start going into other countries and declaring land for just literally grabbing that land for production purposes of said things. So here's my approach to the issue. And it could be that I say supply side approach. And my argument for this is that since bioethanol is an entirely different industry, you can't consider the supply of land for agriculture the same as the supply of land for bioethanol, just because they are different industries. And as we know, supply is the marginal cost of said industry. So I cut supply in half as a result. There's incentives for land grabs by ethanol corporations, and if you were to take this, generalize it even further and say that supply of land itself goes down just for agriculture. So consider this agriculture. Consider that the supply shift to the left as now agriculture, land for agriculture just is gone. What happens as a result? Well, you see that there's an increase in price. Now, a lot of people don't agree, most people don't agree with me on that, and I was hoping that maybe you guys would get into an argument with me on it. But the consensus is that it's just a demand. So it's an increase in demand. Basically, those who produce corn would just they're just active suppliers, and they'll cut their supply between either ethanol corporations, those who are involved in the bioethanol market, and those who are involved in the food market. And that's the consensus, which is pretty much what if you ever heard of a man named Tim Wise, he teaches at Tufts. His thing is based on this idea, and he's a strong opponent of bioethanol. So what does this result in? You have higher food prices. I also say that there's lower gas prices, just because I think gas, and I say gas, I say petroleum, because I think of it as a substitute, but the opposition to that is that they think of it as a complement, because you do need the petroleum for ethanol to go through the E10 registration, the E15 registration. So it depends on what you want to see that. Do you want to see petroleum as a substitute, pure petroleum, or do you want to see it as a complement? I think it's a substitute, so I think that the demand for petroleum itself goes down. But it may as well be the opposite. And the evidence that I say for this, well, this food crisis that we've seen the last 2013, 13 years, and it's actually a huge issue now. If you look in developing countries or just any market outside the United States, you see that there are land grabs. And Mozambique was the most recent one. It was last week. They lost about 10,000 hectares worth of land to bioethanol corporations. And what's the problem with that? Is just that there's also the fact that there are people who produce their own food, like unmarked land, and now that land is taken away from them. So where are they going to produce their own food? They're self-sustaining. Now they have to find somewhere else to get it. So I have a huge issue with bioethanol. I'm not saying that I'm against finding other sources of energy. I'm just saying there has to be a better solution, and that's where I point to electric cars, even though they do electricity is produced through fossil fuels. But I think it's a better solution just because I think that the cost of hunger is much greater than the cost of pollution at the moment. So, what are the alternatives? I honestly don't know. And I don't think the social cost of bioethanol is I don't think the social cost of pollution offset the cost of bioethanol in the long run. So here's where, if you all have any questions for me, I would like to hear some.
Do you think you could reiterate your supply side argument?
Sure. I kind of did breeze through that one. So let's assume that for the supply side, land is finite, and this is only considering for land for agricultural purposes, not land in general. The supply of land is going to always be the same, but for agricultural purposes, it's different. I also make the assumption that people are self-sufficient in developing countries, and they produce their own food. So this is more of a cost of the hunger issue. As there are more and more land grabs, the supply of land for the purposes of making food decreases. So there's a shift in supply to the left. And the way that it's different from the demand side approach is that they're just saying that the demand for crops, specifically corn and now sugarcane, that's becoming more and more popular as a substitute, increases, and that's what raises prices. I say, well, the fact that people just can't make their own food is what also is creating an increase in price. It might as well actually be a combination of the two. The fact that people can't make their own food, and now there's an increase in demand for crops. It could be, that's what makes the rise in prices much greater than what both show. It could be a combination of the two. Notice that if you were to combine the two, the price will still rise, and it will actually be higher in that situation than any of these situations. For simplicity, most people use the demand one. I like to think of it as a supply issue, but they're essentially, they come out in the same, they come out to the same result.
Kind of on that issue, do you have actual evidence of this incidence of land grabs? Because as far as I understand with ethanol, at least in the United States, it's primarily from corn, and the corn that's used to produce this ethanol is largely coming from the American supply corn and coming from Midwest regions, and not necessarily because U.S. corporations are going to other nations.
I never said U.S. corporations. I just said corporations in general.
But when you're saying this concept of land grabs and affecting other nations, so you're making, within your supply side argument, you're making this assumption that it's affecting the amount of land other people in other nations have to produce, food. But does this actually occur directly because of the U.S. ethanol production? Because is the corn that's going to U.S. ethanol production actually largely produced in the U.S., or is there some sort of statistics surrounding that?
Well, current regulation with ethanol is that if you look at all your gas stations now, you see a little marker that says E10. Every gas that you put in your cars right now is at E10 regulation. So there is that increase in demand for ethanol in the United States market. It's actually this week on Monday, they just passed E15 for all gas stations. So they're trying to transition to a higher ethanol production in the gas market in America, which would obviously increase the corn, the demand for corn products from other countries. Or it would be easier just to take control of land there. Coincidentally, last weekend, when I was bringing up Mozambique, there was that 10,000 hectare land grab by fuel corporations. Because fuel corporations are the ones that are primarily taking advantage of the bioethanol market. They go in, and as a result, the people have been displaced from where they produce their own food. So there is evidence of it. It may not be as pronounced in to the United States market, but in countries where the land grabs are occurring, it's normally, I only know of Mozambique, but I know it's huge in the mid region of Africa, not so much the northern or southern. but they have been seeing lots of land grabs, and since 2006, 2007, that's increased, and from 2007 to 2008, the amount of gas, petroleum in the world that contains ethanol went from 3.7 to 5 point something %. And that's mostly as a result of the United States and E10, E15 regulation.
I have a question.
Hmm?
How much of the corn production, for example, goes into ethanol?
How much of the corn production? I honestly don't know how much of it goes into it. I do know that the amount of ethanol production that was done as a world is like a share. It was 87% of all world production of ethanol was held in the hands of Brazil and the United States. Both of them are the ones that do the most. And that is increasing throughout as the bioethanol market becomes more and more important. You can see a correlation between the two. I'm not sure how much of it is actually.
So I was reading a few reports, and they give different results. One of it says 40% of U.S. corn production goes into ethanol, which is a lot. The other one says 27.3%, which is a little bit less. So I don't know what is exactly. There's other factors that drive increasing the price of food, basically. Just considering population, which is a very stupid trend, but that's one of them. And the other one is demand from third world countries and emerging markets is skyrocketing, especially for meat. And you know that livestock is used, they use corn. So there are other factors influencing also the quality of food. The third world countries skyrocketing as well, relatively to what it was before. So that also increases the price of food. So there are other factors driving the. What I'm saying is how much of the price increase in food is driven by ethanol, and how much of it is driven by just simple demand for food, really, just increasing because of the economic development. My second question tied up to that is, actually there's no relationship with that, so I'm just
I can't give you an actual statistic for it. All I do know is that more and more firms are coming into the bioethanol market, as even though fuel companies are the most important ones for bioethanol, you're entering into people who just produce the ethanol. So just more and more little companies that rise as a result to produce it and then sell it to fuel companies. So demand is definitely increasing there as more and more people get into the market. I can't give you an actual statistic as to what it is because I just don't know.
I'd like to call into question your proposition there that this industry is what's responsible, or heavily responsible for the food crisis throughout the world. Just because I know that for a lot of countries, the main problem is actually their lack of infrastructure. For example, for the past 3 or 4 years, India's had huge grain surpluses, but it's gone to waste because they didn't have the storage. And this is like for dry goods that all you need to do to store it is build a building and put it in plastic bags, and then you can have it for years and it's fine. But they don't even have like that kind of infrastructure, so they're throwing away literally tons of grain annually that could be used to feed their India is another country that suffers heavily from starvation. So I don't think that it's a crowding out effect from the ethanol market, but I do agree that I do agree with the point that it is rival in obviously it's rival in the corn industry, which drives the prices up, which in turn would hurt consumers. But yeah, I don't think it's I wouldn't accredit it to the food crisis.
So the food crisis, I always think of it as a hunger crisis rather than like just a prices of food going up. So when I think of it, I think of just people not being able to afford their food. And I think of people, since I know firsthand that most people are they make their own crops, they make their own food and all that, and that's why I brought into the whole idea of land grabs. Because there are people who have been displaced from the land that they built. So that's, when I say food crisis, I think of it in that respect. But the whole idea of grain and all that, that's an infrastructure issue, and that's also driving prices up for food in general. So it's a combination of the two.
Just a question. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Have you ever heard of the Hubbard speak? I mean, this has to do with oil, but I'm just out of curiosity.
Have that.
Okay, I mean, Hubbard speak was a very controversial thing that came out at the time where when you're drilling for oil, you'll have increasing returns because there's oil gushing out of the ground, so on and so forth. And then after a while, there'll be decreasing returns because you won't get as much oil from a well after just exploiting it for years. So that's been happening in most countries, which is making the search for substitutes a lot more prevalent and a lot more necessary. So which is why bioethanol has been rather popular. I mean, you know more than I do about bioethanol. So while this is happening, and while there's now increasing technology, which is, let's just say, shifting that Hubbard's peak to the right, so people are still sticking in oil wells, that even though they're not providing as much profit, because they're able to exploit more oil from that. So while this is happening, and while, let's say, America is a massive, huge, massive bastion of gas underneath, which they're going to exploit in 2016 to 2018, what is it that you've read and you've seen will happen in the future for the demand for bioethanol as a resource for fuel?
Well, actually, that's the reason why I came back to this slide, because natural gas, the fracking technology that we have now, is increasing our quantity of natural gas, and that is becoming a possible fuel alternative. It is slightly cleaner than petroleum. It's not so much cleaner. Even bioethanol is not that much cleaner than petroleum. They never tell you that, because it's still 85% petroleum on the average, or at least 90. So it's still burning a lot of carbon dioxide. But you do raise a good point about natural gas. We should be able to have enough to both power our nation and export. So natural gas may as well replace bioethanol. I personally think that bioethanol will be replaced with natural gas.
This would be more extrapolation, I guess, but you have this assumed like social benefit of reduction of pollution. You just mentioned like the CO2 emissions, but just coming from the perspective when you look at like these bioethanol programs, and most environmental scientists have debunked this and doesn't have the support from that field of study, because they have this concept of like the EROP when they take analysis of emissions that are from the production of bioethanol, and it actually is a lot more polluting than actually just burning petroleum by itself, because you have this secondary cycle of petroleum use where you're using all this petroleum to build the crops, to grow the crops in the first place, and you have to transport it, and you have to process it, and then you're adding it to petroleum itself. So it actually leads to more CO2 emissions, and it's actually worse for the environment. So that, like, if you take that into account, that would kind of debunk the social benefit that you're weighing these things against. Would make kind of turn it.
It's a good thing you mentioned that one, because although I've never actually heard that one, I've heard of something similar, where the fact that bioethanol, since ethanol is a high octane material, it actually has less energy than just pure petroleum, so you have to burn more bioethanol. So as a result, you're going to be releasing more CO2. So there's a possibility that it is more polluting. Everything I've read has kind of said the opposite, but just on that fact alone, that you have to burn more bioethanol to get the same energy as 100% petroleum makes me think that either if it's not greater, it's at least the same. So there's not much of a difference. But where did you read that report?
I don't know, because I'm like an EAP and an econ major, so then just in my G100 class, it's one of the things we talk.
I actually have not heard that one. I've heard more of the high octane issue. So I tend to see it more that way. Go for it, take it. What do you do?
Please.
Well,
All right.
diving over it.
All right.
You mentioned land grab and how the way I see this is just the way I imagine it is a big international corporation going, let's say, small little town and grabbing that piece of land and buying it from someone, because you can't just grab this land.
Usually the government, you buy it from them.
Well, you buy it from the government, and then they build something there. And you mentioned that taking away from people, but I see that as giving to people. They gave jobs, they gave economic prosperity. Drillers are going to come there, drillers need places to live, drillers need to spend money. That raises the earnings for those people, which effectively gives them more earning power in the form of cash to buy more food. So I see this as actually a good thing. This is something people should be not thankful, but eager to exploit.
That raises the issue of real wage and purchasing power of those people to actually afford the food. If they're able to produce more food, then they could actually buy with those new wages from the corporation that's giving it to them, then they actually see a net loss. That's if they can't.
Can you repeat that? No, repeat.
So, yeah, they're given a wage, but now you have to consider that what is the actual purchasing power of that wage for the food, for the current world price of food, in their currency.
Well, I'm assuming that there was no wage to start with. It was just plain land and just mom and papa putting some tomatoes in the ground. That's my assumption. I'm coming from very urban area, so in that kind of sense, I see that as economic development being a plus, no matter, assuming you start from very plain zero.
Okay. Well, that's if you want to think that they're not, that land's not self-sustainable for keeping the production of crops. Just as soon as you just make one crop, so you can keep on adding more and more and more crops. So like after that moment, you can just leave it alone and just keep on producing food for yourself. So that's assuming that, I assume that's what they're able to do. They don't have to spend as much money on actually making other crops as they will have to actually buy the food at current world prices, which are rising. So that's why land grabs, I think, are detrimental to them. Even though, yeah, they're given a job, their real wages aren't enough to afford food, as the prices of food just keeps on increasing as well. And there was a hand that rose over there.
And I just wanted to say that international corporations usually bring in their own labor for it, so the higher paying jobs are not going to be people from Mozambique or the small town. They're mostly just, if it's not automated, they're going to be picking crops or something, which is not going to be high food placed back in.
Yeah.
And if they're doing corn for sale, they're not going to feed them. Then rising food costs, and they no longer can support themselves, so they have to make payments on food.
Pretty much what I was heading in that direction. Any more questions?
I don't know how much reading you've done on the subject, but can you speak to some of the implications that the emerging natural gas industry might have on what you described as a food crisis or a hunger crisis, being some of the degenerative environmental effects that fracking technology has, and its effect on the viability of farmland, and how that might affect the agricultural sector's need to import more crops than did you know?
So I don't know how the technologies work. I don't know how much pollution they cause.
Mm-hmm.
All I do know is that 2018, I believe, was the year that natural gas is expected to export. 2016 was expected to be viable for use in America. And all I know is that raises a substitute issue with bioethanol. That's as far as I know with the readings. I haven't gone into in-depth study as to what will cause how bioethanol is going to be affected with natural gas and which one's better in terms of pollution for the environment.
Yeah. I'd recommend Josh Fox's Gasland, good documentary on the subject.
Alright guys, we have time for one last quick question.
I was just wondering if you had heard about NASA's project where they're trying to make basically huge algae farms.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like supposed to be, it's a bioethanol, but it's non-competitive in the food industry because people don't eat algae generally.
It's funny that you bring that one up because there's land grabs, and now because of that, people have started calling into question something that they call a water grab, like basically where people used to fish and stuff, it's going to be replaced. That one I think is more of a stretch than the land grab one. But it has rose those questions. There's actually do have notes on water grabs as a result because of the algae there. Because I figured someone was going to bring in the whole algae for bioethanol. But that's also another issue. That people think that that's going to increase the prices of fish and just because it will replace the area where fish is with algae.
They actually have to introduce fish into the system in order to make it sustainable. Because otherwise it gets too high, it gets too concentrated with some gas, I think nitrogen. And then when they introduce fish into the system, it like gets eaten and stuff. So it's like they have to introduce more ecological factors in order to make it sustainable. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So I don't think that.
I know somewhere that they said that was going to increase the prices of fish. I think it was, I forgot the exact reason why. But there is the issue of water grabs now too, as a result of the algae demand.
Body's gonna get this, so.
If you guys have other questions, just ask them after that. I'm sorry to interrupt the